On that brilliant blue-skied morning in the waning days of another peaceful American summer, war's clarion call was heard throughout the land as death and destruction flew from those once benign skies. Great seas no longer shielded America's shores. For the first time in its history, the American mainland was subjected to the scale of death and destruction from a foreign attack, as inflicted on Pearl Harbor almost 60 years earlier. Unlike Pearl Harbor, the September 11th attack was not waged by an army or navy, but by terrorists intent on bringing death, destruction, and fear to America and to all of Western civilization. Only a tiny few from among the so much greater many heard the clarion call as their personal call to action and sacrifice. David was one of the tiny few from among the so much greater many who instantly volunteered for service to protect and defend his countrymen and his beloved country itself. David joined with others of the tiny few to devote months of training, preparing them for the conflicts to come. They left behind promising careers and, most importantly, those they loved, who were now also the few from among the so much greater many, wives, husbands, sons, daughters, fathers, and mothers, all bearing the fears and burdens of war's realities. For many of the few from among the so much greater many, they would return as grievously wounded warriors. For far too many others, it was to be their last earthly contact with family and friends. For these dedicated, volunteer warriors who believed so deeply in honor, duty, and country, their personal sacrifices, made so that they may serve, would much too soon become their ultimate one. David was 2 months into his third tour of duty, but his first as a second lieutenant rifle platoon leader. With few exceptions, he and his men were all combat-tested veterans from previous tours. David and his men were asleep for only a few hours following another long night patrol that had been relatively routine. "Wake up, Lieutenant. We have an emergency," shouted Company B's first sergeant as he shook David's shoulder. David woke up instantly and saw that it was early dawn as he raised himself from his cot and said, "Fill me in, Sergeant, while I grab my gear and wake my men." "That's already being done, sir. Fortunately, you didn't have to fire your weapons last night, so we don't have to resupply you. Your men should be on their vehicles in just a few minutes." David quickly finished adjusting his helmet's chin strap as the first sergeant continued. "We received a sketchy radio transmission from the 2nd Platoon's outpost that they're under attack. Their transmission was cut off before we could really assess their situation. The CO wants you there ASAP. We've called in an Apache chopper to scout the area and assist you as needed. It should be on scene a few minutes before you arrive. Sergeant, if you make radio contact with the outpost again, tell them we'll be there within 12 minutes. That'll be 0616, said David as he checked his watch. Within minutes, David and his platoon were on their way in their up-armored Humvees and Bradley fighting vehicles. Everyone knew the risk involved when this second platoon was embedded with civilians only 3 days earlier as part of the new strategy. David assumed that the insurgents had set up IEDs along the narrow street before attacking the outpost. "Lieutenant, there's a major firefight in progress," said the Apache pilot over the radio. "There's heavy smoke coming from the outpost. It looks as though most of your men are in the courtyard behind the main wall." "Apache 1," said David, "we're about a dozen blocks away. I see your chopper. How many insurgents do you see?" "Hard to tell, Lieutenant. I see fire coming from 2 houses across the street from the outpost. I'm going to engage them with rockets now." David watched the barrage of rockets from a distance of only 300 yards as his platoon sped on to the outpost. He and his men cheered as the exploding rockets tore into the enemy-occupied houses. David turned to his platoon sergeant to begin directing his platoon's well-schooled, dismounted counterattack. "Sergeant," David's unfinished command ended with the violence of the improvised explosive device that detonated within only a few yards of his speeding Humvee. David's family would soon learn that he was one more of too many men and women heroes killed serving their country. Eternal life came swiftly. It came without pain, suffering, or shock. David's racing pulse ended just as quickly as fear and forced alertness, amidst almost overwhelming fatigue, all vanished forever. Blessedly, he was aware that his eternal life had begun. It was so natural for him that he felt no sadness or regret for himself as he watched his former comrades weep for their loss of him. David sensed the angels were near. He was not startled when they took his hands in theirs and remained beside him. They were silent as David watched his friends below in their frenzied efforts to save him. "Fellas, I'm okay," he called to them. The angels squeezed his hands gently but firmly as they said, "David, they can no longer hear you. You are with God now. When you are ready, we will guide you to his kingdom." "I know," said David. "It was my first instinct to let them know I'm okay. And I guess I was hoping they'd let my family know that I'll be waiting for them." "We understand," said the angels. The billowing black smoke below became ever so gradually shrouded in a dense mist. It forever blurred the images of war. The scene of death and destruction below imperceptibly faded from David's sight and memory. When the mist lifted, David and his angels were above the top of the purest of white clouds and the bluest of blue skies that he had ever seen. Then, without discomfort, David stared directly into a brilliant white light that was untold times brighter than any earth sun he had ever so briefly glanced directly into. "Is that heaven's light in the distance?" David asked his angels. "Yes, David, that is God's beacon lighting the way for you to heaven. It is his eternal welcome home for you. Is it far from here? Asked David. You will find distance and time to be what you make of them, said his angels. You will be with God forever, yet you will be with those whom you also love, whether on earth or in heaven. Time and place will be of your choosing. In heaven, you are free of longing. You will watch over your loved ones still on earth, and they will feel your love and presence always. Yet your final rejoining with them in heaven will seem as brief as the passing of a single day. Golden shafts from heaven's light enveloped David and his angels, forming a pathway past the stars to heaven. David was soothed by its pleasing warmth and all the scents of a mid-spring day in full flower. He was immersed in the gentle rhythms and melodies of a single flute in all of its ethereal beauty. David had never known such a sense of peaceful calm and pleasure. It is time for us to leave earth, said his angels. It is time for us to step within the golden shafts of light for our journey to heaven. May I look back at earth one last time? Asked David. Of course, said his angels. David turned from the golden tunnel of light and looked earthward. The pristine, pure white clouds began to swirl in an ever-widening circle, streaming into space until they were gone. In the distance, suspended in the blackness of space, David saw a magnificent, brilliant blue sphere, partially shrouded in the very clouds that had hidden it only moments before. Earth's beauty filled David with overwhelming joy. David was now, in the truest sense, part of God's glorious universe of magnificent beauty and wonder. David turned and, with his angels at his side, stepped into the golden tunnel of light. In the far distance, God's brilliant white beacon to heaven shone in all of its glory. Once within the golden shafts, the acceleration was instantaneous. As David sped faster than light itself, all of his memories from his earliest to his last came rushing back. David relished reliving his happy times, his great times, and all his joyous moments with those he loved so deeply. He relived his unhappy times, his sad times, and his unpleasant times with a new perspective. David relived them now as times of learning, times of growing and maturing, but without any of his former anguish. As David relived his entire life in exquisite detail, he was unaware of time having passed. The past, present, and future were all one now. David passed effortlessly through God's brilliant beacon to the glories of heaven. David was home in God's everlasting kingdom to begin his eternal life.